and then they see it. The grand finale, boss monster of your nightmares horror show. It's coming through what used to be a person. It didn't just loom. It oozed, a grotesque masterpiece of claws, tendrils, and existential regret. Jaghatai, cursed in Chogorian. And if you know anything about Chogorian curses, you'll know this thing's ancestral blob family probably got insulted back 17 generations. His storm seers formed a ring around them, their expressions probably screaming, "This is absolutely not what we signed up for." 10 seconds in, 10 storm seers down. That's what we in the historical community like to call a bad start. The thing was flinging diamond-sharp tentacles around like it was hosting the galaxy's deadliest game show, and everyone was on the guest list. Even Horus started bleeding from his eyes. And let's be honest, if the Emperor's favorite son starts leaking warp juice from his face, it's officially time to panic. Then there was Mortarion. The guy who'd spent the entire campaign grumbling about psychers like a crotchety old man ranting about noisy neighbors, suddenly found himself fighting off psychic attacks. The irony was probably lost on him as he was too busy being smashed to his knees by the very thing he'd spent his life refusing to respect. This is when Jaghatai goes full White Scar. His surviving storm seers pull off the psychic equivalent of a magic trick, making him invisible to the monster. Given how many eyes the thing had, that's no small feat. Might as well have been trying to hide a bonfire from a moth. And then, like the galaxy's deadliest prankster, Jaghatai sneaks around the monstrosity, quiet as a shadow. One stab. That's all it took. One perfect, precisely placed stab right into what was probably the thing's equivalent of a kidney. Though honestly, who can tell with these nightmare blobs? And boom! The thing dies in what might be the most over-the-top warp energy explosion the galaxy's ever seen. Part 1. From the personal chronicles of archivist Severus Bloodquill, whose sanity remains questionable after extensive research into the 5th Legion. Let me tell you a tale of the Emperor's forgotten sons, though forgotten might be too kind a word. The White Scars were more like that cousin your family pretends doesn't exist, the one who shows up uninvited to festivities, drinks all the wine, starts 3 fights, and somehow ends up being the hero of the evening. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Imagine, if you will, the tail end of the long night. A name so poetic it almost makes you forget it was just humanity pulling the trigger on itself over and over again until the barrel clicked dry. The Emperor, oh yes, with a capital E, because even thinking otherwise invites a visit from an inquisitor with questions and a nasty collection of tools, decided that what humanity needed wasn't reason or reconciliation, but unification. A nice word for smashing heads together until the cracks fit. And how did he decide to go about it? With a stroke of genius that was equal parts madness and malice, crafting superhuman warriors to drag the rest of us kicking and screaming into compliance. The 5th Legion, though, they were something else. While their more straight-laced brothers were busy measuring the size of their fortresses or trying to blow each other to pieces in increasingly creative ways, the White Scars were the awkward sibling lurking at the edge of the family portrait, sharpening their knives and muttering to shadows in the trees. They were the Emperor's bloodhounds, his pathfinders, the ones sent into the black corners of the map where the ink ran dry and some joker had scribbled, "Here be dragons." And they'd usually come back with dragon heads, still dripping just to prove the joke wasn't funny. Then there was their Primarch, Jaghatai Khan, the great Khan himself, a man who took the term outsider and made it a point of pride. While his brothers were busy erecting marble monuments to their egos or carving their names into the stars, The Khan was out there perfecting a simpler creed. Hit hard, hit fast, leave nothing standing. Why bother with strategy, politics, or plans thicker than a slab of Grok's meat when you could simply be gone before your enemies even realized they'd lost? Appear like a storm, strike like a thunderclap, and vanish like smoke. To the rest of the legions, the White Scars were that strange nomadic clan that rolls into town just long enough to spook the horses, empty the tavern, and leave everyone double-checking their doors come nightfall. And the White Scars? They treated their brothers' opinions with the same indifference a wolf reserves for sheep gossip, barely worth the flick of an ear. They were the wind given teeth, untouchable and unstoppable, as predictable as a one-eyed drunk with a flamethrower. Then came the Horus Heresy. Suddenly, everyone remembered the White Scars existed. Both sides eyed them like a prize to be claimed, a stallion to break and saddle for their cause, which was frankly adorable. Trying to bend the White Scars to your will was like trying to box up a lightning storm. Sure, it might work, if you didn't mind ending up a charred husk in the attempt. The truth is, the 5th Legion had perfected a skill their brothers could never quite manage, the fine and glorious art of not giving a damn. While the rest of the legions tangled themselves in alliances, oaths, and schemes as thick and sticky as a fly trap, the White Scars were out in the Great Black, probably racing solar winds for the sheer thrill or daring space hulks to play chicken. Not because they hated their brothers, mind you, just that politicking and power plays were a bit hard to bother with when you were too busy living louder, faster, and wilder than anyone else. And maybe, just maybe, that was their greatest strength. In a galaxy where everyone else was moving pieces on some grand and pointless chessboard, the White Scars were flipping the table and laughing at the mess. They weren't just the wild card, they were the joker in the deck, the chaos you didn't see coming until it was too late. Even chaos itself couldn't predict them. The first of these magnificent bastards came from the Thulian Basin, a place so bloody cold and miserable, even the Age of Strife took one glance and thought, nope, not worth it. These weren't your usual frostbitten survivors, mind. These were tech-nomads who'd turned freezing to death into a fine art. They roamed the ice wastes in hulking mechanical crawlers, part war machine, part lunatic carnival, and all madness. The Emperor took one look at these half-feral lunatics and said, "Yes, those are the people I want cutting loose across the galaxy. Seems like a safe bet." And thus the 5th Legion was born. They were the Emperor's scouts, his pathfinders, his "let's send these poor bastards to see if the obviously lethal place is actually lethal" brigade. While their brother legions were busy throwing themselves into grand glorious battles, with all the subtlety of an orc mosh pit, the 5th were skulking around in packs smaller than your average bar brawl. They weren't about glory, they were about results. The quiet kind that didn't need a choir or a victory parade. Ever heard of the Star Hunters? Of course you haven't. Nobody has. That's the bloody point, isn't it? They weren't the ones you remembered. They were the ones you didn't notice until it was far too late. Take the Albion Fortress of Dubris, for example. While the rest of the Imperium was still squinting at their war maps and arguing over siege tactics, the Star Hunters had already kicked the door in, raided the place, and left the front gates wide open for invasion. Or the 83-day battle in the Black Catacombs of Kadiru. No shining banners or triumphant parades for that one. Just endless weeks of fighting in the dark, gnawing on whatever unfortunate thing crawled past, while the Emperor's light felt very far away indeed. The 5th Legion didn't just take the thankless jobs, they married them, took them out for a nice dinner, and settled in for the long haul. But there was a price for all that selfless bloody glory. They were dying. slowly, gloriously, and stupidly dying. Every hard-fought victory cost them brothers they couldn't replace, and every battle won left them smaller, lonelier, and just a little closer to the edge. Did they cry for help? Beg reinforcements from their proud brothers? Of course not. They would have eaten their own power armor first. Each new day is a victory, they said, which is exactly the sort of thing you say when you're too stubborn or too stupid to admit you're completely screwed. They were like those ancient Terran creatures, the lemmings, charging headlong towards extinction with reckless enthusiasm. The only difference was they were taking down as many enemies as possible along the way. It might have been the most spectacularly stubborn demise in Imperial history if fate hadn't decided to give them one last unexpected twist: their lost Primarch. When the powers that should not be played their cosmic game of yeet the baby with the Emperor's gene sons, one particularly unlucky, or lucky, depending on your perspective, infant ended up on a world some Imperial bureaucrat with a tragically dull imagination had christened Mundus Planus. The locals, demonstrating a bit more flair, called it Chogoris. It was a world clawing its way back from apocalypse, a place where advanced technology meant cramming gunpowder into tubes and pointing them at people you didn't like. Truly cutting-edge stuff. On one side, you had the aristocrats, your classic overbred, overpolished, and overarmed lot, strutting about in plate armor, hiding behind their tall city walls, and indulging in the sort of sportsmanship that involved hunting tribesmen for fun. On the other side, the steppe nomads, professional horse botherers with a knack for tactical brilliance, living lean and fast on the endless plains. No fancy walls, no glittering cities, just open skies, cold steel, and the sort of life that made you tough or dead, with no room for in-between. This is where the universe decided to drop Jaghatai Khan. And, in a stroke of cosmic humor, he was found by a tribal chief named Ong Khan. Now, picking up abandoned babies usually ends in disaster. But Ong Khan, bless his luck, hit the genetic jackpot. The first hint that baby Jaghatai might not be your average foundling came when his adoptive father's enemies, the Kurayid tribe, decided to indulge in their favorite pastime: murdering the neighbors. On the steppe, this usually kicked off the endless dance of vendetta. You kill some of ours, we kill some of yours. Repeat until everyone's too dead or tired to carry on. A grim little tradition, if predictable. But young Jaghatai? Predictable wasn't really his style. He looked at the whole blood feud business, scratched his head, and asked a simple question. Why stop at some when you could just kill all of them? And so he did. One night, one massacre, and the Kurayid went from a tribe to a grim entry in the annals of steppe history. Jaghatai took the chief's head and hung it in his father's tent, a practical bit of interior design, if macabre, and his first attempt at sending a message. It wasn't subtle, but then again, neither was the point. The message was simple. The old ways of back-and-forth killing were out, and total annihilation. That was the new way forward. Forget tit for tat. Jaghatai Khan didn't deal in tat. From there, Jaghatai embarked on what could only be described as his join or die world tour. Tribe by tribe, he laid out the simplest offer in history: swear loyalty or become fertilizer for the steppes. Turns out people are surprisingly open to negotiation when the alternative is extinction. But here's the clever bit. He didn't just break them, he rebuilt them. Smashed the old tribes together like a drunk blacksmith forging a new blade. Tradition? Out the window. Bloodlines? Didn't matter. Talent was what counted, and if you couldn't keep up, you'd best step aside before you got trampled. Thousands of years of custom reduced to confetti in a whirlwind of innovation. Then things got interesting. Jaghatai ran into the so-called civilized folk of the Eastern Empire. Some noble brat decided to make a name for himself on one of those delightful hunt the tribesmen expeditions. Unfortunately for him, his name turned out to be dead. Details of the encounter are murky, but what is clear is the message that came back with the brat's head. The people of the steppes are yours no longer. The Palatine, an emperor of the sort who tended to take decapitated heirs rather personally, responded by marching west with his whole army. Pikes, gunpowder, heavy cavalry, the works. The kind of polished, disciplined force that made nobles puff up their chests and peasants shake in their boots. Jaghatai's reply, a masterclass in humiliation. The civilized army was slow, stiff, and built for open battle on their terms. Jaghatai didn't fight their battle. He fought his own. His horse archers turned the Palatine's proud forces into the galaxy's largest pincushion, skirmishing them into dust and never standing still long enough to be caught. By the time it was over, the Palatine had less of an empire to rule, and a lot more time to reflect on why bringing a pike to a mobility fight is never a good idea. In less than 20 years, Jaghatai went from tribal chief to planetary ruler, which has to be some sort of speed record for world conquest. He brought peace to Chogoris, the old-fashioned way, by making the consequences of war so horrifically one-sided that everyone decided peace was the better option. Now here's where it gets properly amusing. Jaghatai Khan, fresh from conquering an entire planet, probably still shaking rebel gore off his boots when, boom! Golden light splits the sky, and who should show up but the Emperor himself, with Horus bloody Lupercal in tow. Oh yes, Horus, everyone's favorite son, golden boy extraordinaire, grinning like he owned the galaxy already. And wasn't it just deliciously ironic that it wasn't even the 5th Legion, their professional star-hopping bloodhounds, who found their own Primarch? No, it had to be Horus and his lunar wolves. The meeting must have been a sight to behold. On one side, you've got Jaghatai, a man who'd spent years giving the galaxy's simplest ultimatum, kneel or die. On the other, the Emperor, radiating godlike power and offering pretty much the same deal. The irony? Thick enough to smear on a loaf of bread. The official histories claim Jaghatai was overawed by the Emperor's majesty, which between you and me sounds exactly like something penned by someone who'd never spent 5 minutes with the great Khan. Overawed? Maybe. But if I had to wager, I'd say he was more intrigued than anything else. After all, here was a man who'd just strolled into his world with a bigger army, a bigger vision, and, most annoyingly, a bigger presence. It wasn't submission. It was curiosity. Jaghatai was nothing if not practical. He took one look at those lunar wolves, shiny, polished, bristling with enough firepower to flatten a continent, did the math faster than a mechanicum cogitator, and thought, well, if it isn't my own join or die pitch coming back to bite me in the arse. The Khan of Khans, master of the pragmatic solution, did what any sensible warlord would do. He negotiated. Right then, he probably said, I'll join your grand crusade, but first, we're going to have a little chat about Chogoris. And by chat, I mean you're going to promise me that my planet doesn't end up as one of those dull imperial compliance worlds where everyone files reports and wears matching uniforms. The Emperor, no doubt entertained by the novelty of finding a son who could actually haggle, agreed. They handed Jaghatai command of a legion, thousands of genetically enhanced killing machines, without so much as a How to Rule an Interstellar Empire for Dummies manual. Gilliman and Dawn, ever the responsible older brothers, were beside themselves. "You can't just give him an entire legion without teaching him proper Imperial etiquette," they whined. "What if he holds his bolter with the wrong hand at a formal dinner?" The Emperor, with all the calm indifference of a man who'd seen the galaxy fall apart and decided it wasn't his problem yet, essentially shrugged and said, "He conquered a planet. How hard can running a legion be?" Which, if you think about it, is a bit like saying, "This person's great at herding cats. Let's put them in charge of cyber-enhanced super cats with severe anger management issues." And so began the grand experiment of handing command of a spacefaring legion, armed with technology so advanced it might as well have been sorcery, to a man who'd spent most of his life fighting on horseback and firing black powder weapons. It was like giving a master stone slinger the keys to a Nova cannon. Technically still projectile warfare, just with a slightly higher body count. Jaghatai, being Jaghatai, probably took one look at the first spaceship they gave him, shrugged, and thought, "It's just a really big horse that eats promethium instead of grass." And you know what? It worked, because sometimes the universe, in its infinite wisdom or spite, rewards that kind of magnificent, unshakable insanity. So, Jaghatai inherits a legion that isn't so much a unified fighting force as it is a cosmic version of Where's Waldo, featuring genetically enhanced super soldiers, 50,000 professional vagabonds scattered across the galaxy like someone sneezed while holding a bag of very angry warriors. Most Primarchs would have had a full-blown existential crisis. Jaghatai? He just saw it as Chogoris all over again, except with more spaceships and a staggering amount of paperwork. The Great Khan sent out what might be the galaxy's most aggressively worded party invitation. "Dear scattered sons, get your armored asses to Chogoris immediately or I'll be very disappointed. Love, Dad." Simple, direct, and with just the right amount of implied violence to motivate. Of course, it took nearly a decade for everyone to actually show up, which probably says more about the state of the Imperium's logistics than anyone would care to admit. Still, by the end of it, Jaghatai had his legion, battered, chaotic, and unpredictable, but his nonetheless. When they finally gathered in the empty quarter, it was less proud legion and more armed convention of complete strangers with a shared genetic quirk. Each company had its own heraldry, its own traditions, and, no doubt, its own suspiciously strong recipe for space moonshine. They eyed each other like cats dumped into a dog show, technically on the same side, but bristling with distrust and ready to hiss at the slightest provocation. But Jaghatai had a plan, and like all truly magnificent plans, it started with ritual scarification. 50,000 of the Emperor's finest standing in a field under the bleak, empty sky, passing knives like it's the galaxy's most brutal arts and crafts club. "Right, lads," says Jaghatai, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing here. "Grab a blade, carve something memorable into your faces, and try not to cry about it. Points for creativity, but if you faint, you're walking home." The scars weren't just a bit of grim-faced ornamentation, mind you. They were membership badges, permanent proof that you belong to the galaxy's most exclusive warrior lodge. And as if bleeding out in unison wasn't bonding enough, Jaghatai decided to take it a step further. Everyone got a new name. It wasn't some whimsical "what do you want to be called" nonsense either. Oh no. This was, "What have you killed recently that's impressive enough to make the rest of us not laugh when you say it?" It was less a naming ceremony, more a blood-soaked roll call of death and glory. By the end of it, They weren't just a bunch of scattered companies. They were something else entirely, something far worse. The Khan wasn't content with just making his legion scarred and renamed. That would have been too straightforward. Jaghatai decided they needed something more ambitious: culture. While other legions were busy perfecting the art of mass murder, Jaghatai had his warriors learning calligraphy. That's right, calligraphy. Can you imagine it? Brother, your bolter drills are excellent, but your brushstrokes are an insult to this scroll and our ancestors. Do it again. He called them the noble pursuits. Hunting? Fair enough. Storytelling? Makes sense. What's a good massacre without a bit of post-battle bragging? But the art of making pretty letters? That was pure Jaghatai. The imperial truth said no superstition, and Jaghatai basically said, "Hold my ceremonial fermented mare's milk while I teach my legion how to commune with spirit animals." As you can imagine, this went down like a lead bolter with some of his brothers. Lorgar of all people, had the nerve to criticize someone else's spiritual practices. This from the man who was essentially writing religious fan fiction in his spare time. And Guilliman? Oh, poor Guilliman. You could practically hear the aneurysm forming as he tried to figure out where tribal spirit quests fit into his beloved organizational charts. Probably somewhere between ritual scarification and unorthodox cultural enrichment initiatives. But the Khan didn't care. He didn't need approval. He was carving out something that was his, something wild, something that no one, not Guilliman, not the Emperor, and certainly not Lorgar, could put in a box. Now, having convinced his legion to carve up their own faces and compose heartfelt poetry, Jaghatai decided it was time for some proper family bonding. And by family bonding, of course, I mean hurling his entire legion into the clusterfuck called the Colon Circle. The Colon Circle was what you'd get if you took every horrific thing in the galaxy, stuffed it in a bag, shook it until it got angry, and scattered it across a few dozen worlds for good measure. The 103rd Pioneer Company, bless their suicidally curious little hearts, had stumbled upon this charming neighborhood years earlier. Their report: "Everything here wants to kill you. Highly unrecommended. Wish you were here." But Jaghatai, being Jaghatai, took one look at this death trap and thought, "Perfect! Just what I need to teach my boys some teamwork." It was like organizing a family reunion in an active volcano. Technically possible, but with significantly higher odds of someone being burned alive. The Khan scattered his most trusted Chogorian brothers, the Kashig, throughout the companies like responsible adults sent to keep order at a children's party. Chinsha, Targutai Yesuge, Hasik Noyan Khan, names that would one day echo through history, assuming anyone could pronounce them without tripping over their own tongue. Their job? Simple. Make sure everyone learned the Khan's way of war, hit hard, ride fast, and look bloody magnificent doing it. 1 in 10 didn't make it out of the Colon Circle alive. But those who did, they came out as brothers. Nothing forges bonds quite like wading through hell with someone who's just as covered in blood and just as unlikely to see tomorrow as you are. The orc hordes of Sengomar and Vorgeist learned this the hard way. The White Scars introduced them to the ancient Chogorian military doctrine of stab and scoot, a tactical masterpiece that boiled down to stabbing things as hard as you could, then vanishing before anyone had the chance to stab back. Simple, effective, and guaranteed to leave the enemy frustrated and dead, mostly in that order. Some company spent 3 years marooned in the darkest, most miserable parts of the Colon Circle, where the options boiled down to work together or die horribly. Spoiler alert, they went with option 1, though not without sampling a fair bit of option 2 along the way. But here's the thing, Where most legions might have called for a tactical withdrawal, that's High Gothic for running away like terrified groks, the White Scars only seem to get more excited. Because if there's one thing a White Scar loves, it's being told they're probably going to die. And Jaghatai? Oh, Jaghatai was right there in the thick of it, swinging his blade like a lunatic at anything unlucky enough to cross his path. At first it was follow the Primarch or die, but over time it turned into fight near the Primarch and maybe get a starring role in his war stories. Jaghatai didn't just fight battles. He performed them, turning the carnage into something between theater and a slaughterhouse. A Khan of Khans, cleaving through his enemies like a whirlwind with a grudge, while his sons scrambled to get close enough to witness the spectacle. For them, the battlefield wasn't just a place to fight, it was a stage. And everyone wanted front-row seats to the greatest show in the galaxy. Nobody back on Terra seemed too concerned about the fact that the White Scars were more loyal to their Khan than to the Imperium. After all, who could possibly imagine a Primarch turning against the Emperor? That could never become relevant later, right? When the dust finally settled on Kolan, what little dust was left after 5 years of fire, blood, and carnage, Jaghatai had exactly what he wanted. A legion that fought as one, thought as one, and probably drove Imperial administrators utterly mad as one. The White Scars weren't just those weird cousins nobody mentioned at family gatherings anymore. No, they were those weird cousins everybody had to talk about, loudly, awkwardly, and with a nervous glance toward the nearest exit. Because once you'd seen them fight, there was no forgetting. Fast, deadly, and utterly unpredictable, they weren't just a legion anymore. They were a storm, and the galaxy was starting to notice. So there they were, fresh off their murder vacation in the Kolan Circle, ready to show the galaxy what a properly unified White Scars Legion could do. And what timing! They'd landed squarely in the everything is on fire and we're winning phase of the Great Crusade, a golden age for those who enjoyed violence, conquest, and scribbling overly dramatic poetry about both. Now you might think being one of the smaller legions was a disadvantage, but the White Scars, they took that supposed weakness and turned it into an art form. While the other legions were playing how many warriors can we cram into this battlefield, the Scars were perfecting their signature move, materializing out of nowhere, ruining everyone's day, and vanishing before the enemy even had time to scream, "What the hell just happened?" Their style of war was like a cosmic practical joke where the punchline was always death. The Imperial fists would build a fortress and challenge you to crack it. The Ultramarines would hand you a 500-page manual on how they plan to kill you. The White Scars? They just happened. One moment, you're basking in the glory of your flourishing Xenos empire. The next, your cities are on fire, your armies are in tatters, and you're pretty sure the distant laughter you hear is mocking you in haiku. Some of their brothers, looking at you, Guilliman, couldn't handle it. "Where's your strategic assessment?" they'd whine. "Where's your PowerPoint presentation on battlefield logistics?" Meanwhile, the White Scars were halfway through conquering the sector, probably scrawling calligraphy on the wreckage just to rub it in. Death comes swift and sure, like lightning from cloudless skies. Oops, there goes your head. These so-called barbarians were in fact enormous nerds. Oh sure, everyone assumed they were just out there hitting things really hard, but they were also collecting knowledge like particularly violent librarians, artificers, philosophers, artists, you name it, they had it. chances are they killed you while calmly debating the finer points of calligraphy. As our boy Sanguinius once put it, and I'm quoting here because the fabulous Hawkboy had a way with words, "They smile often and they laugh when they kill," which, when you stop and think about it, is utterly terrifying. There's nothing quite like being butchered by someone who's clearly having the time of their life doing it. But the White Scars weren't mindless berserkers like the World Eaters, nor were they shaggy, howling murder machines like the Space Wolves. Oh no, the White Scars were sophisticated murderers, thank you very much. They had a code, they had honor, they had style. What truly separated the White Scars from their more infamous savage brothers was simple. They chose their wildness. It wasn't some mindless fury that consumed them. It was a weapon, sharp and deliberate, wielded like a perfectly balanced blade. They weren't bound by civilization's chains. They decided which chains to wear and which to break. The White Scars weren't just warriors. They were artists of war, poets of violence, philosophers of the fine and ancient craft of hitting things really hard while going really fast. But did their brothers see this nuance? Appreciate it? About as much as an orc appreciates interpretive dance. When the White Scars killed, it wasn't just murder, it was respect. The "you fought well, so we'll kill you properly" kind of respect. Romantic in its own horrifically violent way. While other legions were busy drafting lengthy apology notes for excessive force, the White Scars were writing haikus about the fallen. "You died well, we'll write a poem about it. Now if you'll excuse us, we've got places to be." But oh, the drama of being the least favorite child. Despite being absolute masters at what they did, they were dismissed as the followers, the tagalongs, the "oh yeah, those guys" legion. It was like being the greatest artist the galaxy had ever seen, only for everyone to pat you on the back and say, "Nice doodles, mate." Jaghatai, bless his magnificent mustache, didn't exactly make things easier for himself. While his brothers were busy playing political chess, hosting formal dinners, and generally trying to outdo each other in the most imperial contest, Jaghatai was off being deliberately mysterious, and probably laughing about it. Some of them thought he was just a savage? Fine. He'd be the most sophisticated savage they'd ever seen, just to mess with their perfectly coiffed heads. Now, let's talk about Jaghatai's friend group. Or, well, the distinct lack of one. Magnus the Red? Oh, best bros forever. Two misunderstood nerdy outcasts bonding over philosophy, secrets, and what it's like to have most likely to go rogue, written under their names in the Primarch yearbook. Probably spent their downtime swapping thoughts on warp theory and existential dread. Horus liked him too, because at the time Horus actually had good taste. Sanguinius? Oh, Sanguinius liked everyone. The golden boy of diplomacy couldn't help himself. Friends with everyone, best friends with no one, because he was just that annoyingly perfect. And the rest? Well, let's just say Jaghatai wasn't exactly swimming in birthday party invitations. He wasn't interested in their squabbles. After all, why bother with the politics of gods when you've already mastered the art of riding the storm? Yet the universe was getting smaller, all neatly mapped out and labeled, the wild frontiers tamed and parceled off. No more uncharted voids, no more endless horizons to race through. The White Scars were like the last wild horses, standing on the edge of a shrinking steppe, watching fences creep across their plains. The Khan wasn't blind. He could see it coming, looming on the horizon like a storm cloud ready to break. The choice was simple, but no less cruel for it. Remain true to their oaths, keep their honor, and quietly fade into irrelevance. Or, well, there's always another option, isn't there? The chance to be wild and free again, to run ahead of the storm one last time. All it would cost was everything they'd fought for. It's like that ancient Terran saying, "Better to burn out than fade away." Poetic, really. But what happens when the only way to burn bright is to set the whole bloody world on fire? When you're staring down the choice between fading into nothingness or making damn sure the galaxy remembers your name, even if it's written in ash. Let me tell you about the time 3 Primarchs decided to have a delightful little family outing to Drune in the year 881 of the 30th millennium. Horus, everyone's favorite, Lupercal, Mortarion, I hate everything, especially magic, Deathlord, and Jaghatai, just here for a good time, Khan, all rolling up with their legions for what they assumed would be a quick compliance action. Now, Drune was supposed to be the pride of civilization, a shining jewel, the sort of place you'd slap on the front of an imperial tourist brochure. Come visit Drune! We have gates! And oh, did they ever have gates? Massive, towering monstrosities, the kind that didn't just say, "Keep out!" No, these gates screamed, "We're hiding something absolutely horrifying, but please, come in anyway." So there they were, 3 of the Emperor's finest sons, standing outside these ominous gates like door-to-door salesmen hawking the imperial truth. And what did they get for their trouble? Nothing. Not even a polite, "Go away, we're not interested." Just silence. Horus, being Horus, decided that subtlety wasn't really his thing. His solution? Knock. And by knock, I mean swing his favorite mace at the gates like a toddler throwing a tantrum with a hammer. But wait, enter Kulek Sen, Stormseer extraordinaire, with the galaxy's least comforting weather report. Lords, slight chance of soul-crushing domination today, with a high probability of someone pulling your strings, like a particularly gruesome puppet show. Mortarion, as charming as ever, waved it off with his usual disdain. "Pfft, magic," he grunted, because nothing screams Death Guard quite like ignoring perfectly good psychic warnings about your imminent, horrifying doom. So they break in, because of course they do. And what do they find? The galaxy's largest gathering of unwashed zombies. Not your run-of-the-mill brains zombies, oh no. These were the haven't bathed in a decade and are probably being puppeteered by some interdimensional horror kind. Very exclusive club. Membership by possession only. Kulek decides to try again. "Seriously, my lords, this is bad news. Maybe we should, leave?" And this time, Jaghatai actually backs him up. Because shocking as it might sound, the Khan has this bizarre habit of listening to his advisors. Right about then, the sky starts doing things skies definitely shouldn't do. Warping, swirling, glowing in colors no sane mind should ever have to process. And wouldn't you know it? 100,000 people suddenly decide to practice their synchronized groaning routine. It wasn't just a bad situation anymore. It was a complete cosmic disaster, with bonus moaning. Turns out the whole planet is one big puppet show for some warp-based Xenos with a serious domination kink. Lovely. And who gets handed the delightful task of untangling this mess? You guessed it, our boy Jaghatai. Horus, in a rare display of actual good judgment, decides that the guy who understands warp stuff should probably be the one dealing with the warp stuff. Shocking logic, really. So what does Mortarion do? He drags his Death Guard off to sulk in the metaphorical corner, technically following orders, but making damn sure everyone knows just how unhappy he is about it. His soldiers probably spent the whole time stomping around and glowering like a bunch of moody teenagers, while Jaghatai got on with the business of fixing things. Because if there's one thing the Khan excels at, it's cleaning up other people's messes while looking annoyingly good doing it. So, 6 months of chasing floating blobs around a planet. Not exactly the most dignified campaign in Imperial history, but when the blobs in question can mind control entire populations and toss out warp lightning like party favors, you take what scraps of dignity you can get. The White Scars naturally made the best of it, riding around really fast, stabbing things, and generally being a mobile nightmare, just another day at the office for them. Meanwhile, their Stormseers were busy doing the psychic equivalent of giving the enemy a migraine, a very fatal migraine. But the best part, that was saved for the grand finale, something straight out of a fever dream. Picture this. They're marching through the city, and the air itself is screaming at you. Not in some poetic, metaphorical sense either. No, it's actually screaming, like the sound of 1,000 souls having a bad day all at once. Cracks in reality are yawning open left and right, giving everyone a lovely view of the warp. And let's be honest, the warp is never a good sign unless you've got a thing for mood lighting that comes with a free side of eternal damnation. And then they see it. The grand finale, boss monster of your nightmares horror show. It's coming through what used to be a person. It didn't just loom. It oozed, a grotesque masterpiece of claws, tendrils, and existential regret. Jaghatai, cursed in Chogorian. And if you know anything about Chogorian curses, you'll know this thing's ancestral blob family probably got insulted back 17 generations. His Stormseers formed a ring around them, their expressions probably screaming, "This is absolutely not what we signed up for." 10 seconds in, 10 Stormseers down. That's what we in the historical community like to call a bad start. The thing was flinging diamond-sharp tentacles around like it was hosting the galaxy's deadliest game show, and everyone was on the guest list. Even Horus started bleeding from his eyes. And let's be honest, if the Emperor's favorite son starts leaking warp juice from his face, it's officially time to panic. Then there was Mortarion. The guy who'd spent the entire campaign grumbling about psychers like a crotchety old man ranting about noisy neighbors, suddenly found himself fighting off psychic attacks. The irony was probably lost on him as he was too busy being smashed to his knees by the very thing he'd spent his life refusing to respect. This is when Jaghatai goes full White Scar. His surviving Stormseers pull off the psychic equivalent of a magic trick, making him invisible to the monster. Given how many eyes the thing had, that's no small feat. Might as well have been trying to hide a bonfire from a moth. And then, like the galaxy's deadliest prankster, Jaghatai sneaks around the monstrosity, quiet as a shadow. One stab. That's all it took. One perfect, precisely placed stab right into what was probably the thing's equivalent of a kidney. Though honestly, who can tell with these nightmare blobs? And boom! The thing dies in what might be the most over-the-top warp energy explosion the galaxy's ever seen. Now, some scholars like to sit around, stroking their chins and asking, what if Jaghatai had waited? What if he'd let the monster keep attacking his brothers? To which I say, have you met Jaghatai Khan? That's like asking, what if water wasn't wet? Or what if orcs took up peaceful gardening? Ridiculous questions with equally ridiculous answers. Of course, there's no happy ending here. There never is. The entire population of the planet, dead, just dropped. Considering they'd been mind-controlled meat puppets for who knows how long, maybe that was a mercy. Try putting that in an Imperial compliance report. Planet liberated. Population achieved a 100% casualty rate. Mission success? Somewhere around the year 980 of the 30th millennium, our boy Jaghatai decided he was bored of playing cartographer and took about 5 brotherhoods worth of his finest murder artists out to the Mandragoran sector. Which brotherhoods exactly? Well, that depends on who's telling the story and how deep into their Amasek bottle they've gone. Lo and behold, they stumble across these absolutely pristine human worlds. Clean gene stock, advanced tech, the works. It was like finding a perfectly preserved archaeotech relic, except instead of one shiny gadget, it was several entire planets. Naturally, Jaghatai, being the reasonable man he was, stopped laughing, decided to try diplomacy first. "Hello, long-lost cousins," he basically said. "Would you like to join our lovely Imperium? We have dental." Their response? They shot at him. Diplomacy, it seemed, wasn't on the menu. The space battle was short, brutal, and about as one-sided as a grok stampede. Turns out, bringing local system defense ships to fight a Legion fleet is like showing up to a Titan duel with a Magnum 44. The defenders didn't stand a chance. Jaghatai, being impressed by their courage, or maybe just in a particularly good mood, actually let the survivors retreat. Classic Khan. That kind of sporting behavior really messes with people who like to pigeonhole him as some uncivilized brute. Then came the ground battle. Oh, what a spectacle! Thousands of white scars versus a few hundred defenders in armor, so thick they looked like someone had tried to repurpose Titans into onesies. These guys were walking tanks, bristling with so much firepower, a Mechanicum Magos would have fainted at the sight of them. Most legions? They'd have gone for the direct approach, charging in headfirst with a hearty battle cry and maybe a dramatic one-liner or two. But the White Scars turned it into the exciting game of Tag You're Dead. Their jet bike riders zipped around the walking fortresses. One minute the defenders were invincible juggernauts, the next they were falling apart in pieces, wondering what the hell had just happened. The White Scars were running circles around them, literally, like cats toying with particularly well-armed mice. The defenders, sticking rigidly to their formation-based strategy, might as well have been reading from a playbook on how to lose to chaos theory. Then Jaghatai joined the dance, and let me tell you, it was like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight, except this knife was being wielded by a demigod who moved faster than your targeting systems could even blink. It was butchery. The great Khan carved through their ranks like they were made of particularly stubborn butter, leaving nothing but wreckage and regret in his wake. But here's where the story takes a turn. Jaghatai did something no one expected. He showed mercy. Not just mercy, respect. Instead of finishing the job, he picked 3 of his best warriors to act as ambassadors. "Look," he said, "you fought well. Let's not drag this out. Join the Imperium. Keep your cities. Maybe we can swap recipes for fermented mare's milk and call it a day." They sent the ambassadors back in pieces. And if there's one thing worse than making Jaghatai Khan angry, it's making him quietly angry. The kind of anger that doesn't shout, doesn't roar, doesn't threaten. The kind that simply acts. That night, the White Scars burned a trail of ash and blood across the stars. City after city, world after world, until they reached the Pale Emperor himself. His finest warriors, dead. His gilded gates, kindling. His palace guard, fertilizer. And there he was, this so-called emperor, sitting on his tiny throne, probably rethinking a fair few of his life choices as Jaghatai Khan, drenched in the blood of his subjects and the ashes of his empire, came to have a little chat. Now, the official version, sanitized, polished, good for inspiring loyalty, has Jaghatai delivering some grand speech about pride and consequences, leaving the Pale Emperor alive as a warning to others. But the old Chogorians? Their version? Well, it cuts deeper. It's the kind of story that stays with you, like a power sword humming just above your throat. In their telling, Jaghatai wasn't just talking to the Pale Emperor, he was talking to himself. You have chosen the doom. I could not. You have chosen pride over servitude. Think about that for a moment. Here's Jaghatai Khan, the man who chose to kneel to the emperor, standing before someone who made the opposite choice. Someone who chose defiance over survival, independence over submission. Someone who embraced the doom that Jaghatai had turned away from. The great Khan left the Pale Emperor alive, not as a warning to others, but as a reminder to himself. Of the price of pride, yes, but also the cost of surrendering it. Every small emperor the White Scars put down, every shattered throne, every burning city, they were reflections of what they might have been. Echoes of a path Jaghatai didn't take, but never quite stopped seeing in the distance. You want to know how the White Scars really fought? Imagine if a lightning bolt decided to take up competitive stabbing. That's basically what they were, nature's own surprise you're dead delivery service. While other legions were busy practicing their war faces in the mirror, the White Scars were out there perfecting the fine art of chaos. Jaghatai had one simple idea. What if we just took everything that worked on the steppes of Chogoris and did that, but in space? And wouldn't you know it, smashing things really hard while going really fast works everywhere. Who knew? The Khan knew. The Khan always knew. And then came Ullanor. Oh boy. The biggest, greenest, nastiest horde of orcs the galaxy had ever seen, led by an overlord whose name sounded like someone sneezed while trying to say Uruk twice. Urlak Uruk. The White Scars rolled into Ullanor alongside the Ultramarines. Talk about your odd couples. The Imperial Army, the Mechanicum's finest, and enough titans to make even the most jaded planetary governor weep with joy. It was the kind of war that made everyone else's battles look like petty playground scuffles. And there was Horus, standing center stage and soaking up the glory as he got promoted to War Master. The Khan and Horus. Now there was a bromance for the ages. Of all his brothers, Jaghatai only ever really clicked with two of them, and Horus was the first. Then came the parting of ways. Everyone packed up. The warp lit up like a Life Day celebration gone horribly wrong, and the Great Crusade marched on under shiny new management. The Emperor, off to Terra to lock himself in his basement and tinker with his super-secret webway project. And Horus? He got the keys to humanity's war machine, the whole grand mess placed neatly in his lap. Finally, we have arrived at the Council of Nikaea, or, as I like to call it, that time everyone got together to argue about magic while pretending it wasn't magic. Grab a drink, friends, this one's a real mess. The Emperor decides it's time to settle the galaxy's most awkward debate since, should we let Perturabo design party venues? The question on the table, are psychers good, bad, or just really, really misunderstood? Of course, you had the usual suspects front and center. Magnus the Red charging in with zero subtlety, and Sanguinius trying to win hearts and minds by looking too damn pretty to argue with. But here's the real twist. The guy who actually wrote the rule book, the one who came up with the framework they were all arguing over. Yep, our boy Jaghatai. That's right, the Khan of Khans, The guy everyone thought was just here to go fast and stab things turned out to be the galaxy's first psychic health and safety inspector. No, brother, you can't just fling warp lightning without a proper grounding protocol. Yes, that includes helmets. Did he get credit for it? Of course not. His name wasn't even in the data cores. Classic white scars, doing all the work while someone else gets the glory. Meanwhile, Magnus is probably getting all the applause, and Sanguinius is over there looking heroic in the perfect lighting. The whole Imperium was built on this grand idea called the Imperial Truth. No gods, no magic, just good old-fashioned human superiority. Meanwhile, the Chogorians were sitting in the corner like, yeah, about that. We've known about the warp forever, and it's basically an ocean of cosmic horror. Good luck with all that. The Chogorians called it the Test of Heaven, which admittedly sounds much fancier than don't let your soul get eaten by warp creatures. Even the space wolves were quietly playing the same game with their rune priests, though they'd rather kiss a tyrannid than admit it. No, these aren't psychic powers, it's just the spirit of Fenris. Yeah, that's it. Naturally, the Khan and Big E had some heated father-son chats about this. Hey, Dad, maybe telling everyone the warp doesn't exist when it definitely does is a terrible plan. But the Emperor, ever the optimist, was fully committed to his ignorance is bliss strategy, which worked about as well as trying to hide a titan behind a potted plant. And poor Magnus wanted to go full chaos, full psyker. No restrictions, no training wheels, just here's some phenomenal cosmic power, try not to summon any demons by accident. Meanwhile, the responsible ones, yes, really, like the Khan and Sanguinius were saying, maybe we should have some rules. Like, don't try to read the mind of a warp entity just because it looks interesting. But Magnus, he had to go and Magnus everything up at Nikaea. It's like he looked at the entire situation and thought, how can I make this as uncomfortable as humanly, or inhumanly, possible? He didn't just cross the line, he did a backflip over it while juggling warp fire and shouting, "Look at me, brothers!" Enter our unsung hero of the hour, Targutai Yasugai, a so-called junior librarian, who walked into the galaxy's most contentious debate and essentially said, have you all tried just not being idiots about this? Picture this poor Stormseer, probably the only adult in a room full of godlike egos, standing there and delivering the most sensible argument of the day. Psychers are like any other weapon. Train them properly, don't let them chat with demons, and everything will be fine. Revolutionary concept, really. It's like suggesting you teach people how to use bolters instead of handing them out and hoping for the best. But the Emperor was clearly having a shit day. Magnus, bless his fiery red head, had pushed every button he had, so naturally the response was to ban everything. No psychic powers, no librarians, just a big, shiny, galaxy-wide no. Except navigators and astropaths, of course, because apparently even the Emperor realized the Imperium would crumble without them. Hypocrisy? Never. Just selective practicality. And where was our boy Jaghatai during this circus? That's the best part. He wasn't even there. Nope. The great Khan was off in Kondax, chasing down orcs because Horus said so. The same Horus who definitely didn't have any ulterior motives for keeping the Khan as far away from Nikaea as possible. None at all. Later, Jaghatai would realize what we're all thinking. He should have been there. Not just there, but planted firmly between Magnus and Sanguinius. But no, there were orcs to kill in Kondax. Just some leftover green bits from Ulanor, nothing major. The kind of cleanup job that most Primarchs would have turned their noses up at. Not Jaghatai. No, he was actually excited about it. Open spaces, cavalry charges, enemies that didn't stop fighting until they were all properly dead. It was practically a vacation for him. The entire Legion went along, all revved up and ready for the hunt. And why wouldn't they be? This was their kind of war. Clean, simple, and straightforward. No politics, no debates about psychic ethics, no endless arguments about the nature of the warp. Just good old-fashioned Xenos elimination. Funny, isn't it? How the biggest moments in history sometimes hinge on the smallest decisions. A Primarch goes hunting instead of attending a council. A Legion misses the debate that could have changed everything about the future of psychic powers. A War Master's subtle manipulations slide neatly under the radar. So there the White Scars were, having a lovely time hunting orcs in the Kondak system, as one does, when suddenly the galaxy's worst game of telephone kicked off. And let me tell you, when your only source of information is astropathic messages during a warp storm, you might as well be getting your news from a warp-juiced prankster. First, the news comes in. Lehman, I really hate sorcerers, Russ, has gone rogue and killed Magnus. Which, to be fair, the Russ killing Magnus part probably sounded believable to anyone who'd ever seen them interact at a family dinner. But wait! Another message drops. Actually, no, it's Horus who's gone traitor, and he's dragged half the legions into the abyss with him. Welcome to What's Actually Happening, the game where all the reports are contradictory, and none of them make sense. A. Russ has gone rogue. He hasn't. B. Help the Alpha Legion. Definitely don't. C. Ferris killed Fulgrim. Other way around. Oops. D. Mars is in revolt. Oh, that one's true. E. Everything is fine. Absolutely nothing is fine. Some of these messages were months old, some were hours old, and all of them were about as trustworthy as an inquisitor trying to blend in. And the Khan. He just wanted to finish killing his orcs in peace. Instead, he finds himself dragged into the galaxy's worst family drama, delivered via the galaxy's worst postal system. Then Horus, being Horus, and by now fully evil Horus, sends word. Hey, go punch Russ in his wolfy face for me, would you? The Khan takes one look at the dodgy space mail and decides maybe starting a Legion war based on some second-hand gossip isn't the best idea. Sensible, really. The most sensible decision anyone's made since Magnus decided to redecorate the Emperor's webway. And just when things couldn't get messier, who shows up but Russ himself, fresh from turning Prospero into the galaxy's largest bonfire. Hey, he says, I'm actually loyal. And oh, by the way, the Alpha Legion is trying to kill me. Because apparently the Alpha Legion had been nursing a grudge against the Space Wolves for not appreciating their sneaky methods enough. Imagine being Jaghatai at this moment. You've got your entire legion revved up and ready to go. Everyone's staring at you for orders, and you're stuck trying to figure out who's actually loyal. It's like trying to solve a murder mystery where all the witnesses are lying, everyone's armed, and some of them might also be possessed by demons. The Khan doesn't like this game. He'd rather be out there slicing problems in half with a scimitar. But no, politics. And right when things couldn't possibly get more aggravating, who should show up? The Alpha Legion in all their infuriating, enigmatic glory. They just sat there, menacingly, not responding to calls, not attacking, just accumulating ships like they're collecting trading cards. Every time the White Scars moved a ship, the Alpha Legion moved theirs to match. It was like dancing with your own shadow, except your shadow might actually be trying to kill you, or help you, or neither, or both, because Alpha Legion. Meanwhile, here comes Rogal Dorn, master of stating the obvious and builder of very large walls, sending messages from Terra. Come home right now and ignore anything Horus says because he's definitely evil, which you know might have been useful information several months ago. And then it hits him. The Alpha Legion wasn't trying to fight them at all. They were basically just keeping the white scars in place just long enough to make sure they got Dawn's message. Why? Because again, Alpha Legion, that's why. They wanted the white scars to go to Terra, but they couldn't just say that, because apparently being straightforward is against their Legion rules or something. But here's the thing about the Khan. He doesn't play by anyone's rules except his own. Not Terra's, not Horus's, and certainly not the Alpha Legion's extremely complicated ones. The white scars were nobody's puppet, nobody's backup plan, nobody's convenient reinforcements to be summoned when needed and ignored when not. "We'll find our own truth," said the Khan, while doing a sick bike trick just to emphasize the point. Because that's what it means to be a white scar. You don't take anyone's word for anything. You don't dance to anyone else's tune. And you definitely don't let the Alpha Legion think they're cleverer than you. So the Khan decides he's had just about enough of this tedious galactic staring contest. The Alpha Legion's out there playing their little games, lurking, posturing, doing their best impression of a sinister fog bank, and Jaghatai's patience is wearing thinner than a guardsman's flak vest. Time to leave this particularly aggravating party. How? By ordering the galaxy's most synchronized "ignore them" maneuver. The white scars collectively ghost the Alpha Legion, leaving their every calm and maneuver hanging like an unanswered prayer. Every Primarch had their own particular kink when it came to ship design. Korax was all about skulking in the shadows. Sneaky bastard loved a stealth rig. Vulcan, ever the pragmatist, wanted his vessels built like flying fortresses, all thick armor and brooding menace. And Fulgrim, well, you can bet he couldn't resist slapping some gilded trim and a disco ball on the bridge. But Jaghatai, his tastes were refreshingly simple. The only note he left for the Mechanicum was 4 words scrawled across the blueprints in bold letters: "Make it go faster." For decades, the White Scars Tech Marines worked tirelessly to turn their fleet into a collection of hyperspace hot rods. Who cared if the guns didn't have the range to hit a barn door, or if troop capacity was slim? All those limitations were just excuses from people who didn't know how to think fast. When your ships were streaking through the void at impossible speeds, who needed long-range firepower? The Scars would be on top of their enemies before they even knew they were under attack. Speed wasn't just a feature, it was the bloody doctrine. They kept the upgrades close to their chests. No flashy demonstrations, no bragging, no revving the metaphorical engines at the corner of Maine and Terra. To outsiders, the Scars fleet looked fine, functional even. Sure, some records mentioned elongated engine housings and extravagant thruster configurations, but no one realized what the Scars had under the hood until the moment it mattered. So there they are, locked into what looks to be the most frustrating stalemate. The White Scars staring down the Alpha Legion in a perfectly matched game of naval brinkmanship. Ships lined up, weapons primed, each side waiting for the other to blink first. And then the White Scars begin what looks like the laziest, most half-arsed breakout maneuver ever attempted. It's slow, it's clumsy, it's practically embarrassing. And the Alpha Legion? Oh, you can imagine the smirks behind their helmets. The Khan's not crazy enough to start a full-blown battle, they're probably thinking. And to their credit, they're absolutely right. Jaghatai wasn't crazy enough to start a battle. He was crazy enough to do something much, much worse. The Alpha Legion keeps up their precision. Laser batteries fire in perfect volleys, the arcs so tight they could have been plotted by the Emperor himself. The White Scars fire back, but it's all oddly restrained, controlled. like a polite little duel between fencers who don't actually want to poke anyone too hard. And then it happened. Oh, you beautiful, sneaky speed demons. There they were, looking all defeated and disorganized, like a bunch of rookies who'd forgotten which end of the ship goes forward. When suddenly, 5 seconds! That's all it took! While the best Imperial Navy officers would need 5 minutes, hundreds of course corrections, and half a bottle of Amasec just to think about attempting such a maneuver, the White Scars just did it. Like it was nothing. Like they'd been practicing this move since they were in space diapers. One moment you're the Alpha Legion, feeling pretty smug about your perfect containment strategy, and the next moment the White Scars fleet transforms like some kind of enormous mechanical predator. Their escorts, those beautiful, deadly little ships, shot through space like they were riding the lightning itself. They were doing corkscrews in void warfare. It was less like a military maneuver and more like a school of space dolphins decided to show off their synchronized swimming routine, except with more explosions. The Alpha Legion's fancy bronze-proud destroyers? Gone. Poof. Turned into very expensive space confetti before they could even update their status reports to "oh no." And there was the Swordstorm, magnificent beast that she was, leading the charge like some enormous metallic stallion. The Alpha Legion's capital ships tried to stop them. They really did try, but they might as well have been trying to catch lightning with a butterfly net. The White Scars didn't just break through the blockade, they turned it into modern art. A dozen Alpha Legion ships turned into impromptu navigation beacons, glowing in their wake. When they broke free, they went even faster, because apparently maximum speed was just a cute suggestion to these maniacs. They hit their Mandeville points and jumped into the warp, while the Alpha Legion was still trying to figure out what in the name of both Alphareuses just happened. When they broke free, they went even faster, because apparently maximum speed was just a cute suggestion to these maniacs. They hit their Mandeville points and jumped into the warp, while the Alpha Legion was still trying to figure out what in the name of Omegon just happened. So the White Scars did what any sensible person would do when caught in the galactic mess of who's a traitor today. They decided to consult the only person who could cut through all the warp-drenched nonsense, Magnus the Red. The logic was as simple as it was desperate. If Magnus was alive, there was still hope. If he wasn't, well, they'd better start practicing how to say we're thoroughly fucked in Chogorian. Probably best to prepare a song about it too, something upbeat for the inevitable executions. When they arrived at Prospero, it didn't take long to notice something was off. You know how a major star system is supposed to hum with life? Void trails streaking the black, ships buzzing around like flies on a carcass, maybe even a billboard flashing "Best Souvlaki in the Segmentum." Yeah, there was none of that, just silence. Once it had been a jewel of the galaxy, a perfect little slice of cultural decadence, all glittering ice caps and soft sunrise hues. A planet that made Terra look like an overgrown trash heap. Now it looked like someone had handed the universe's biggest grudge holder the keys to an exterminatus machine and told them to go nuts. Blackened ruins, smoldering ash, and the kind of devastation that practically screamed, "Someone had a really bad day here." The Khan, probably having what was shaping up to be the worst day of his immortal existence, decided to blockade the planet. Sensible, really. He added a little footnote to the orders, too. If you see anything remotely Fenrisian, kill it. Then came the real fun, landing on Prospero. Fun in the way that gargle razor blades might be called educational. The planet's atmosphere had apparently decided it wasn't taking visitors. No conventional landings, no easy approaches. So what does the Khan do? He takes 12 of his finest warriors and teleports down to the surface naturally. Because when a planet's busy tearing itself apart and the atmosphere's screaming, "Do not enter," that's definitely the time to try your luck with experimental transportation. And then they arrived in Tiska, or at least what was left of it. The city wasn't just destroyed, it was erased. A blank space where a hub of culture and learning used to be. The great libraries where knowledge flowed thicker than blood, gone. The shimmering spires that pierced the sky like blades, reduced to slag. Even the overpriced coffee shops, those cozy little havens for scholarly types with too much parchment and too few manners, were nothing more than warm rubble now. If the wolves had done this, and let's not kid ourselves, it was definitely the wolves, then maybe their boasts weren't just the usual drunken bravado. The Emperor's executioners, they like to call themselves. Have you heard about the warrior lodges? No? Then let's spread some light over these shining examples of why we can't have nice things. You know how the Emperor, the immortal genius who created superhuman demigods and conquered the galaxy, had one very simple rule: no secret clubs. Because secret clubs inevitably turn into cults, and cults inevitably turn into massive galaxy-burning disasters? Yeah, well, guess what some bright sparks decided to do anyway? These weren't your casual, let's meet on Thursdays and play some golf sort of clubs. Oh no, these were full-blown, let's plot the downfall of everything we've ever stood for societies, complete with all the cloak and dagger nonsense you could imagine. They spread through the legions with horrifying efficiency, including, and this is the part that makes me want to throw a chair, into the white scars. So while the Khan was down on Prospero, the large members in his legion decided it was the perfect time to say, "You know what this situation needs? Treason!" Spearheading this glorious disaster was Hasik Noyan Khan. They'd been in contact with Horus's people since Kondax. While the Khan was out there trying to make sense of a galaxy gone mad, these sneaky little Grox droppings were already sending love letters to the War Master. You have to admire the audacity, really. Stabbing someone in the back while they're too busy trying to save your sorry hides to notice. Which brings us to Shiban Khan. Good old Shiban. Probably the only person in the entire Legion who was still using more than 2 brain cells. He figured out what was going on, because you know it wasn't exactly subtle, and went straight to Jamulan Noyan Khan to sound the alarm. And Jamulan? What does he do? Dismisses him, brushes him off, essentially says, "Go sit in the corner and think about what you've done, Shiban." Because apparently, warning about impending treachery is now grounds for a timeout. But Shiban wasn't about to let a little thing like direct orders to do nothing get in the way of saving the Legion. He heads back to his ship, the Kaljian, looks around at this circus of treachery unfolding before his eyes, and decides, not today, Chaos. Not on my watch. Calls up his entire brotherhood and asks, "Who's in for punching some traitors right in their throne, damn faces?" Meanwhile, the Khan is strolling through the gigantic ashtray of Tiska. The air stinks of soot and failure. His Terminator escort stalk behind him. The Khan had always had complicated feelings about Leman Russ. But now, seeing what Russ and his wolves had done to Prospero, let's just say Russ might be moving down a few pegs on the Christmas card list, maybe all the way off it. And then it came. The buzzing, that low, insidious hum, creeping in at the edges of your mind like the sound of doom itself. The Psych Nuyen. Imagine ghost wasps from hell, twice the size of a Terminator, and just done with the entire concept of physical laws. They didn't really move, they glided. Not your garden variety, oh no, a bug kind of problem. These were more your by the Emperor's rotting bowels, what is that kind of problems. They used to be physical creatures, actual tangible nightmares that laid eggs in Psyche's brains. The Thousand Sons used to hunt them down like pest control. You can't hit them. Physical weapons pass through them like trying to punch fog. But can they hit you? Of course they can. Their stingers, their horrible ghostly stingers, slid right through Terminator armor like it was cardboard. So there's the Khan and his warriors, discovering that being the galaxy's finest fighters counts for exactly nothing when your enemy doesn't even exist in the same bloody dimension as you. The good news? The bugs were blind. The bad news? Everything else. And then, because this day wasn't fun enough already, the ground decides to join the party by completely giving up. The Khan takes the express route to the basement level of Prospero, loses contact with his warriors, and finds himself in what appears to be the setup for yet another horror story, a maze of underground caves. The Keshig were caught between the hammer and the anvil, a predicament as grim as any they had ever faced. Their Primarch lost to the yawning depths below, and around them the Psychnuine closed in. Chinsha, ever the voice of icy pragmatism, gave the order, retreat. But even for hardened veterans like these, loyalty ran deeper than reason. To abandon the spot where their Khan had fallen, it wasn't just unthinkable, it was sacrilege. So they hesitated, as men often do when caught between duty and despair. That hesitation cost them. Their valiant rescue effort dissolved into a desperate, stumbling withdrawal as the Psychnuine descended on them with an unrelenting fury. Bolter shells passed harmlessly through their ghostly forms. Blades struck nothing but empty air. The Keshig, warriors who had faced nightmares with a smile, were driven back like cornered animals, herded toward a bombed-out terrace where they prepared to make their final stand. Grim faces under helm and hood, blades gleaming in the ash-dim light, they awaited the inevitable. Something extraordinary happened. The air itself seemed to ignite, roaring to life with purple-tinged flames that danced and flickered in unnatural patterns. A wave of psychic power surged through the chamber, obliterating the ethereal insects in an instant, their forms unraveling into nothingness. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. From the shadows stepped a figure as improbable as the salvation he had just delivered. A warrior clad in crimson armor, his Mark III battle plate pitted and scarred from battles long past, the iconography of the Thousand Sons etched into every plate. He moved with the grace of a predator and the weariness of a man who had seen too much sorrow. "I am Revuel Arvida," he said, "Sergeant of the 4th Fellowship, Corvidae Cult." Here he was, a ghost of a legion long dead, a lone survivor in a city that had become a graveyard. He'd navigated Prospero's nightmares, mastered its dangers, and somehow endured. It was Arvida who led the Keshig to what relative safety remained. A ruined audience chamber, once grand enough to host dignitaries from across the galaxy, now little more than a mausoleum for shattered dreams. His story, when he told it, was fragmented, frayed at the edges like the man himself. Time had become a sick joke in this cursed place, its meaning warped beyond recognition. His armor's chronometer was long since destroyed, and he spoke as though trapped in an endless cycle of survival. Yet his mind was sharp, his powers sharper still, and his assessment of their situation was brutally clear. "The Khan will endure," Arvida assured them. "He was forged by the Emperor's own hand. But you?" His gaze swept across the Keshig, cold and calculating. "You'll find only death if you continue this search." Chinsha, as ever, was unmoved. Duty ran deeper than fear in the veins of the Keshig. The Khan was their gene father, their soul, and they would not abandon him. One final attempt would be made. No more hesitation, no more retreat. Arvida studied them in silence, his crimson helm masking whatever thoughts churned behind those pale blue eyes. Perhaps he saw in them the same stubborn defiance that had marked his own legion. Perhaps he saw men already doomed. Either way, he relented. "Very well," he said at last, his tone heavy with resignation. "I'll aid you. Once my strength has returned, we'll face what lies below, together." The Khan's descent into Prospero's underworld wasn't so much a journey as it was a surrender. Every path led further down, twisting and coiling as if the planet itself were a living thing determined to keep its secrets buried deep. The silence was absolute. He finally arrived in a chamber so vast it could have swallowed mountains, an amphitheater carved by unknown hands. The walls glittered faintly with veins of metallic ore, catching what little light there was and throwing it back like dying embers. Scattered brass instruments lay broken and twisted across the floor, a silent symphony, shattered and forgotten. And there were bodies, mortals, buried under layers of ash and debris, their stories as lost as the city above. So much for survivors. The Khan, a master of reading battlefields and parsing truth from ruin, stood in the middle of it all and admitted the bitter truth. He'd been a fool for coming to Prospero, and an even greater fool for coming in person. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was a funeral. And then came the ghost. Not just any ghost, because of course nothing about this day could be simple, but Magnus. Or rather, what was left of him. A fragment. A shadow. The shade stood taller than the Khan, just as Magnus had in life, with that same piercing, one-eyed stare that could strip a man bare of his lies. But now, that eye wandered, unfocused, as if it saw too much and not enough all at once. And the Khan, demonstrating that even the Emperor's finest creations are not above poor decision-making, stood there gripping his sword. Because if there's one thing you should definitely try to stab, it's a memory. "You were right," the Shade said. Under different circumstances, hearing those words might have been cause for celebration, but being right about your brother's impending doom is a hollow sort of victory. The truth was worse than the Khan had imagined. Everyone had been played for fools. The warp, the so-called great ocean the Thousand Suns had so eagerly embraced, was no friend. It wasn't even neutral. It was a predator, hungry and patient, wearing the mask of wisdom. Horus was its masterpiece. The greatest soul, the furthest fall. Magnus painted a grim picture. The War Master, now so saturated with warp energy, he was practically a walking tear in reality, a thing no longer bound by flesh or reason. This, Magnus explained, was the price of pride. His attempt to warn the Emperor had earned him nothing but ruin. His legion? Scattered. His world? Ash? His soul? Torn apart, piece by agonizing piece. All because he couldn't let go of the belief that he knew better. That same pride had consumed Horus, and the same pride had been carefully stoked and wielded by the ruinous powers, or, as Lorgar, in all his theatrical flair, had dubbed them, the primordial annihilator. Brother against brother, betrayal upon betrayal, all spun from the thread of pride. And there stood the Khan, one of the last pieces on a shattered board, the player who had never declared his hand. For so long, the White Scars had been overlooked, dismissed as little more than riders in the void, too fast to matter. Yet now, when everything else was falling apart, they found themselves at the center of the galaxy's dying attention. How ironic that their famed speed had kept them just slow enough to be one of the last to choose a side. The choice, as Magnus's shade presented it, was elegantly simple and impossibly complex. Stand with the Emperor's failing dream or join Horus in tearing it down. Loyalty or revolution? Asked the ghost of a brother who no longer had the luxury of choosing either. Magnus spoke of his own fate with the weary acceptance of the damned. He had broken the Emperor's wards to deliver his warning about Horus, and in doing so had destroyed everything he had spent centuries building. Their father, it seemed, was as forgiving as a bolt round to the head. The Khan, ever direct, questioned whether this was truly his brother's shade before him. He had come seeking counsel from a friend, not riddles from a ghost. Yet even as a fragment, Magnus pressed him about sides, about choices. When Jaghatai declared he would choose neither betrayal nor tyranny, Magnus offered the tired smile of one who had already learned this lesson the hard way. "There is no middle path," the shade insisted. "The next time we meet, we'll either be allies or enemies." A rather dramatic way of saying, pick a side. But then, Magnus had always had a flair for the theatrical. The Khan's regret about missing Nikaea spilled out then, the meeting that might have changed everything. "Horus sent me away," he said, finally voicing the truth. "There are no accidents." But Magnus, or whatever piece of him this was, had no time for past regrets. The future beckoned, even if Jaghatai saw none worth claiming. The truth came out then, sharp as a blade. The Khan had only been in it for the hunt, Magnus claimed. The hunt that had kept his legion pure, but also kept them away, kept them out of the great game being played. "So easy to keep out of the conversation," Magnus said, with that particular bite that only brothers can manage. Their final exchange carried the weight of centuries. "You were always my friend," said the Khan, and in that moment of truth, he did what needed to be done. His Tao flashed out, and Magnus, or what remained of him, shattered like a mirror dropped on marble, 1,000 reflections of what might have been scattering into nothing. In the silence that followed, the Khan stood motionless, as if the slightest movement might break something even more fundamental than his brother's shade. The great reflecting caves, once magnificent, now seemed to mock the emptiness of the moment with their ruined grandeur. At least now he knew. The truth was clear, the traitor unmasked, the path forward set in stone. The call to war could be given without doubt clouding his mind. But knowledge, as is often the case, brought no joy. In those empty caves beneath a dead world, something more than a ghost had been laid to rest. The dream had died, and with it, the last hopes of avoiding the coming storm. While their Primarch confronted ghosts below, the White Scars fleet teetered on the edge of civil war. Drune Khan, ever the helpful traitor, was warning Hasik about their failed recruitment of Shiban Khan. Their plan was simple enough: hold the capital ships, and the rest would fall into line like good little dominoes. The Lodge brothers, in that special way traitors have of justifying themselves, were quite convinced the Khan would thank them later. Horus and Jaghatai had always seen things the same way, they told themselves, which just goes to show that even superhuman warriors can be spectacular self-deluding idiots. The Lodges had dreamed of transforming the White Scars into something greater. Then came their moment of triumph, Horus's ships appearing on the augur readings. The lodge members probably felt quite pleased with themselves, right up until Shiban Khan decided to remind everyone why you don't mess with the Brotherhood of the Storm. Picture, if you will, the dumbfounded faces of the bridge crew as white scars came screaming through the void on what were essentially souped-up space motorcycles, the Sojutsu pattern void bikes. Because sometimes a regular jet bike just isn't crazy enough for void warfare. Shiban found them a way in, one unshielded dock. The Brotherhood of the Storm rode their bikes straight into the ship's gravity field, which is exactly as insane as it sounds. Poor Hasik. There he was, thinking he had everything under control, when suddenly half his fleet erupted in chaos. His great moment of triumph turned into a desperate scramble for control, surrounded by his fellow conspirators who had all convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. The tragedy wasn't just in the betrayal, but in the conviction behind it. These weren't mere opportunists. They genuinely believed they were freeing their legion from tyranny. They stood resolute because, as they saw it, they had no choice. Just like they'd had no choice when they joined the lodges, when they contacted Horus, when they decided to betray everything they once stood for. Hasik stood on his bridge, probably wondering why those supposedly friendly traitor ships weren't answering his calls. The clash came at a staircase landing. The Brotherhood of the Moon waited behind pillars, while Torgun tried his hand at diplomacy. Hasik speaks for the Kagan now. What followed was perhaps the most reluctant battle in Imperial history. Brothers who had fought together across countless worlds now turned their blades on each other. But there was no joy here, no battle cries, no whooping war chants, just the cold mechanical application of violence against those they'd rather not kill. They pulled their strikes, these sons of the storm. Against orcs, they would have carved deep, made sure of the kill. But these were brothers, so they broke bones instead of hearts, crushed armor instead of skulls. It was a dance of restraint, each warrior trying to disable rather than destroy. The combat was everything the White Scars weren't supposed to be: cramped, joyless, confined. No room for their signature flourishes, no space for the artistry of war they'd perfected across the stars. Just brothers hurting brothers in a space too small for anything but regret. Shiban pushed them forward, trying to inject some of their usual speed and power into this grim business. Torgun answered with typical Terran stubbornness. Neither commander's heart seemed truly in it. How could it be, when every fallen warrior was a brother lost? Then came the retreat, too clean, too organized to be real. Torgun's forces fell back as one, and Shiban's warriors, trained to pursue a broken enemy, followed their instincts right into the trap. From the high terraces above, a storm of bolter fire tore into the advancing warriors, turning the bridge deck into a charnel house. The air filled with the screams of the dying and the sharp tang of scorched ceramite. Those who survived scrambled for whatever cover they could find: crates, consoles, even the bodies of their fallen brothers. Above them, Torgun's forces stood resolute, having turned the bridge into a fortress. Sharpshooters lined the terraces, their barrels trained on every exposed angle. Terminators loomed like stone gargoyles around the command throne, their fists bristling with crackling power. Warriors locked down every choke point, every corner, every shred of strategic ground. It was a perfect ambush, cruel and efficient. Beyond the bridge's shattered viewports, the void told a story even grimmer. Death Guard vessels prowled the black, their bloated forms casting shadows over the battlefield. These weren't the Sons of Horus ships the White Scars had been expecting. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Even their supposed allies in treachery had betrayed them, and then more ships appeared, running dark and silent at the system's edge. Their intentions were unclear, but the menace was unmistakable. Inside, chaos reigned. The White Scar's fleet hung motionless, frozen by the divisions that had finally burst into the open. Across the void, brother faced brother, weapons trained on the very men they had once called kin. Hasik still spewed words of loyalty and understanding, his voice calm, almost pleading, even as his actions made a mockery of everything the Legion had ever stood for. Then came the flash of teleportation. The bridge lit up like lightning splitting a darkened sky, and Jaghatai Khan Khan appeared with his warriors, their arrival marked by the growl of shifting bolter barrels. Another 100 guns added to the equation, every one of them primed and ready. Weapons that had once been turned outward toward conquest and glory now turned inward toward their own. The mortal crew scurried for shelter, their breaths ragged and terrified. But one figure stood apart, moving through this tableau of looming violence with a calm that defied the chaos. She wore a general's uniform, its creases marred by ash and battle. But her eyes held a certainty sharper than any blade. While the others panicked, she strode forward, unflinching. She carried something far more valuable than courage: information. She had the Khan's location, and more than that, she had been working in the shadows all along, quietly, patiently, creating the tiny chances that might yet save the Legion from tearing itself apart. The Keshigs' return to the shattered square brought them face to face with fresh nightmares. The air itself betrayed them, twisting and writhing as the Psychnuin emerged from nothingness, their spectral forms coalescing into shapes that defied sanity. Again, weapons proved useless, but the Keshig were not without hope. Arvida stood among them, prepared. Each blast of his psychic lightning turned the intangible horrors solid. For a moment at least, just long enough for the white scars to cut them down. Yet it wasn't enough. With every second more horrors emerged, massive scarabs with shells like obsidian, mantids towering over the warriors, claws like sickles, and then the things that defied description entirely, their forms flickering, shifting. Arvida burned brighter, his power turning the very air electric. The Keshig struck down every solidified creature within reach, their blades rising and falling with desperate efficiency. But the tide was endless, a spectral swarm growing larger with every heartbeat, threatening to drown them in sheer numbers. As Chinsha readied himself for what seemed their final stand, salvation came, swift and brutal. One of the creatures exploded into fragments, and from the wreckage stepped their gene father, the Khan. His Tao burned with otherworldly power, cutting through creatures that should have been untouchable, his movements the very embodiment of deadly grace. He flowed like water, struck like a storm, and in his hands the impossible was rendered mundane. These creatures were born of the warp, but so was he. The truth, bitter and profound, was unavoidable. The Primarchs themselves were not wholly of the mortal plane. Whatever comfortable lies Malkador and the Emperor had spun for the masses, it was clear that the power of the warp coursed through them as surely as blood in their veins. When asked what he had seen in the depths below, the Khan's answer was as heavy as the ash that choked the air around them. "There's no single villain," he said, "no simple architect of this tragedy. Only betrayal, stretching back further than we care to see. Rust destroyed Prospero, but Magnus was already lost before the first blow fell. And behind it all, Horus. The War Master had orchestrated it all, pulling strings, setting traps, driving brother against brother. A tragedy with no end in sight, only deeper shadows ahead. The moment of grim reflection shattered as light pierced the toxic clouds above, a shaft of brightness cutting through the gloom. A new presence announced itself. The Keshig moved to shield their Primarch, weapons raised, eyes sharp. But Jaghatai stilled them with a gesture. He knew this presence. It had stalked him since Ulanor, lingering at the edges of his awareness like a shadow that refused to fade. Patient as death, quiet as inevitability, and now, at last, it stepped into the open, a player long hidden, but never absent. Through the fading teleport energies they emerged, 6 death shroud in their bone-white Terminator plate, their man-reapers held ready, green vapor still curling from their armor. But it was the 7th figure that drew all eyes, towering over his elite guard like death incarnate. Mortarion stood before them in brass and corpse-white ceramite, his dark green cloak stirring in Prospero's poisoned winds. Skulls hung from his belt like grim trophies, and his drum-barreled pistol bore the marks of countless kills. His amber eyes gleamed beneath his tattered cowl, while toxic vapors leaked from his battle plate to hiss against the dead earth below. When he planted silence, the greatest of all man-reapers, into the dust, it seemed less a gesture of peace than a promise of what was to come. The Khan saw the changes in his brother immediately. Mortarion's power had grown, but it was a dark growth, like cancer rather than strength. His flesh had become bleaker, his posture more hunched, yet his aura of menace had deepened beyond what it had been even at Ulinor's triumph. Their exchange revealed much. This was no messenger from Horus. Mortarion had come of his own accord, bearing his own vision of the future. He spoke of a galaxy for warriors and hunters, free from the Emperor's constraints. When pressed about Horus's leadership, he dismissed it with casual certainty. The War Master might burn himself out reaching Terra, but what came after would matter more. The bitter irony of Mortarion's position was not lost on the Khan. Here stood the great enemy of sorcery, the champion who had fought to ban psychers from the legions, now allied with forces drowning in warp power. The Death Lord spoke of the Emperor's hypocrisy regarding the warp, yet his own position had become equally compromised. His grand project, to silence the witches, to pass power to the uncorrupted, had backfired spectacularly. The edicts of Nikaea had achieved nothing. Now Horus welcomed sorcerers, Lorgar taught forbidden arts, and Magnus would surely join them. Mortarion had succeeded only in surrounding himself with everything he despised. The Khan saw through Mortarion's predicament with perfect clarity. The pacts had been made, and now the powers of the warp would come to collect their due from the Death Lord, who had once sworn to destroy them. Mortarion's plea revealed his desperation. He stood alone now, with no allies against the sorcerers he despised. Neither the blood-mad Angron nor the shadow-haunted Kurzay would stand with him against the tide of corruption he had inadvertently helped unleash. When the Khan refused to be drawn into his brother's downfall, the Death Lord made his final gambit, speaking of the White Scar's internal division, offering a choice between power or irrelevance. The Khan's response was a smile of pure contempt. They were never meant to be emperors, he explained, but outriders. The difference was that Jaghatai had embraced this truth, while Mortarion had fought against it. Their clash was inevitable, speed against implacability, lightning against the storm wall. The Khan moved with blinding swiftness, but Mortarion's strength was almost beyond measure. Each blow the Death Lord absorbed seemed to feed him, like a leech drinking in the power of the strikes. Around them, Death Shroud and Keshig fought their own brutal battle, their bodies joining the dust-covered dead on Prospero's blighted soil. For the first time in his countless years of warfare, the Khan felt true fatigue creeping into his limbs. Yet Mortarion too showed signs of wear, blood staining his pallid features, his breathing ragged through his rebreather. Mortarion's scythe crashed against the Khan's defenses like a battering ram. Armor in ruins, toxic gas burst from broken vials, and blood painted their blades wine dark. The Khan gathered himself for one perfect thrust, one chance to end it all. But Mortarion suddenly stilled, listening to some distant report. His laughter came as a sickly cough through his mask. The choice, it seemed, had already been made in the void above. The teleport light came as a final insult, snatching away the Death Lord and his guards before the battle could reach its true conclusion. The Khan's final strike cut only empty air where his brother had stood moments before. There, they stood in the ruins. The Khan, his surviving Keshig, and the lone son of Magnus. Their only hope lay in Arvida's powers, in a column of witch light reaching up through Prospero's poisoned skies. The teleportation chamber erupted with light and sound, and from its heart emerged the Khan, his armor ravaged, his cloak in tatters, his face a mask of cuts and burns. Behind him came his Keshig, and an exhausted son of Magnus, while before him lay a scene from nightmare, his own sons locked in fratricidal combat. Mortarion's words proved true. The bridge of the Swordstorm had become a battlefield where brother fought brother. Some warriors faltered at their Primarch's return, the madness of the moment finally breaking through their battle fury. Others fought on, too lost in their private wars to notice their Gene Father's arrival. The Khan moved through the chaos like a storm given form, his Tao still wet with a Primarch's blood. His presence alone began to still the combat, warriors looking up from their duel to see what they had become in his absence. The silence spread like a wave until only one figure remained defiant. Hasik Noyan Khan, standing before the command throne. Hasik spoke of acting for the good of the Legion, of reuniting the Khan with Horus, as if betrayal ever could be justified. The Khan's fury built with each word, until at last Hasik made his final fatal mistake, raising his blade against his Primarch. The Khan's Tao moved with terrible precision, piercing through Terminator plate. He lifted Hasik from the ground with one hand, removing his helm to look into the eyes of his betrayer. The Khan's judgment fell like a hammer. The white scars were his Ordu, bound by his word alone. No power in the universe, not Horus, not even the Emperor himself, could change that truth. The freedom Hasik had been given was unprecedented among the legions, and he had repaid it with treachery. His body struck the command throne with enough force to crack it, a final mark of his betrayal. For an instant, vengeance called to the Khan, urging him to unleash his wrath upon all who had strayed. But the void beyond the observation ports showed the true battle. Lance fire cutting through space, shields flaring as Death Guard ships engaged their prey. There was no time for a full accounting. The Khan's voice rang out across the bridge, promising a reckoning to come. But for now, there were other battles to fight. The White Scars formation surged forward, their pent-up fury finding release in the Void War. Even outnumbered, they fell upon the Death Guard ships with all the ferocity of their namesake, turning their shame and rage into a storm of energy weapons and striking runs. The Second Battle of Prospero proved somewhat anticlimactic compared to its predecessor. The Death Guard found themselves in an uncomfortably fast-paced naval battle. Mortarion, displaying the better part of valor, or perhaps just common sense, withdrew his forces before they could be completely outmaneuvered. The Death Guard left a trail of plasma in their wake, while presumably nursing both damaged ships and wounded pride. The aftermath brought its own challenges. The Khan undertook the grim task of personally visiting every battleship, rooting out the last embers of rebellion. Some Lodge members, facing the consequences of their choices, chose a warrior's death. Others offered their blades in surrender, hoping that contrition might weigh against treachery. A few ships simply vanished into the void, taking their shame and their divided loyalties with them. Hasik Noyan Khan, who had so recently stood proud upon the command throne, now walked to his confinement like a man already dead inside. With him went others, Gogal, Hibao, Torghun Khan, all awaiting judgment under the watchful eyes of the Keshig. The old laws of Chogoris were clear about the price of betrayal, though perhaps death would be easier than living with such dishonor. Arvida, last son of a dead legion, found refuge among the White Scars. He spent long hours with Jaghatai Khan, their conversations known only to themselves and the Khan. The Khan himself retreated to his chambers, preparing for the Kurultai that would determine the Legion's path forward. For 4 years, the White Scars played their deadly game of hit and run across the void, proving that even superhuman demigods can be thoroughly annoyed by someone constantly raiding their supply lines. Though effective, this strategy had its drawbacks, namely, running out of White Scars. Losing 20% of your legion tends to focus the mind wonderfully on finding alternative approaches. After the Iron Warriors demonstrated at Iluvuin that they'd finally figured out how to counter White Scars' tactics, primarily by having more guns than the Scars had warriors, the Khan decided it was time to make for Terra. The universe, however, had other ideas. Between the ruin storm blocking their path and the combined fleet of the Death Guard and the Emperor's children, the White Scars found themselves running out of options. Their tactics had become predictable. The quest for the Callium Gate proved to be an elaborate feint, though it cost them dearly. Qin Shah, wearing the Khan's armor, faced the grotesquely transformed Lord Commander Eidolon, sacrificing himself to maintain the deception. His last act was to extract a promise from Arvida, who was barely holding himself together against the flesh change, to find a cure for his legion's curse. The true objective was far stranger: a crystalline void station housing the dark glass, an ancient device that made the navigator houses nervous enough to send an agent to destroy it. The White Scar's desperate gambit required someone of immense psychic power to operate the throne at its heart. Jaghatai Khan, proving that Stormseers understand both dramatic timing and dramatic sacrifices, took the throne as the station crumbled around him. His final gift to his legion was a path through the webway to Terra, though even this road wasn't without its challenges. Demons, it seems, take particular offense to shortcuts through their domain. Arvida, already fighting his own body's betrayal, guided the fleet through the horror until he finally collapsed, his body surrendering to the change he'd fought for so long. In the end, Malkador the Sigillite had plans for Arvida, because of course he did. The Regent of Terra never met a complex situation he couldn't make more complicated. The solution? Take one part dying thousand sun, add a fragment of Magnus's psyche left over from his catastrophic invasion of the Imperial Webway, mix thoroughly, and create something entirely new. Thus was born Eanius, later Janus. first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. The White Scars arrived at Terra to find Rogel Dawn had turned the Imperial Palace into the galaxy's largest fortress, while Sanguinius and his Blood Angels stood ready to defend it. The combination proved fortuitous. Dawn's immovable object, Sanguinius's righteous fury, and the Khan's perpetual motion machine. While the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels held the walls beneath an endless storm of fire, the White Scars did what they did best: appear where least expected, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy could respond. They turned Terra's once proud streets into killing grounds, their hit-and-run attacks frustrating the traitors' advances time and again. When the walls finally cracked and defeat loomed close, the Khan revealed that he'd been playing a longer game. Instead of throwing his forces against the traitors' flanks, he gathered his Ordu and what remained of the Imperial Army's tank divisions for one decisive strike. The Lion's Gate spaceport fell to their dawn raid before the garrison even realized they were under attack. The Khan's strategy proved devastatingly effective. The spaceport's defense lasers, now turned against the traitor fleet, cut their reinforcement capability in half. The traitors, learning from their mistake, albeit too late, heavily fortified the Eternity Wall spaceport against similar attempts. When Horus finally fell to the Emperor's wrath aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the White Scars showed that they could be as relentless in pursuit as they were elusive in battle. They hunted the retreating traitors through Terra's streets, cutting off their escape routes. The great scouring that followed suited the White Scars perfectly. After all, who better to hunt down fleeing traitors than warriors who had mastered the art of the pursuit? As the traitor legions fled toward what would become the Eye of Terror, the White Scars were there, ensuring that every step of that long retreat was paid for in blood. For 70 years after the heresy, the Great Khan rode the stars, hunting down those who had betrayed mankind. It was almost like the old days of the Great Crusade, except now every victory also carried the bitter taste of what had been lost. When he returned to the Yasan sector, he found his hunting grounds had attracted new predators. The Drukhari, ever opportunistic, had seized their chance during the chaos of civil war. They learned rather painfully that stealing from the Great Khan's people was somewhat less than wise. The garrison he'd left on Chogoris had done what White Scars do best: fight independently and refuse to give ground. Some of his commanders complained they should have concentrated solely on defending Chogoris rather than trying to protect the whole sector. The Khan, displaying his characteristic appreciation for initiative, praised their efforts instead. Though privately, the loss of any of his people to the Dark Eldar's raids lit a fire of vengeance in his heart. The Yasan campaign began with the kind of success one might expect when a vengeful Primarch decides to clean house. The Khan's fury gave the campaign its momentum, while Chogoris provided the resources to keep it burning. Then came Guilliman's Codex Astartes, suggesting that perhaps legions shouldn't be quite so legionary. The Khan, who had been letting his commanders operate independently since before it was fashionable, saw no problem with this arrangement. If anything, it formalized what the White Scars had been doing all along. He asked only one thing of his sons: finish what they'd started in the Yasan sector. They could do it their way, of course. White Scars' tradition demanded nothing less. For a time, it seemed the Khan had found his purpose again. The thrill of the hunt, the joy of conquest, it was almost enough to make one forget the scars the heresy had left. Almost. But somewhere in those stars, pursuing some enemy into the darkness of the void, Jaghatai Khan disappeared. The White Scars say he still hunts. Perhaps he does. After all, what better fate for the great Khan than an eternal pursuit, forever chasing down humanity's enemies through the endless stars? Some say he vanished into the maelstrom. Others claim different fates. But his sons believe, with the certainty of those who knew him best, that somewhere out there, the great Khan still rides. The Khan's final years were spent doing what he did best, hunting. He swept through Kyobos like a cleansing storm, drove the Dark Mechanicum from Enope's corrupted forge temples, and put down the mutants of Eoclite. But it was the Drukhari who drew his deepest ire, their raids as elusive as smoke on the wind. Until, of course, the greatest hunter in the Imperium spotted their pattern. Where others saw random strikes, Jaghatai saw a design so complex it required a Primarch's genius to unravel it. The Drukhari, in their ancient arrogance, had wanted him to see it. They had forgotten that sometimes when you bait a trap, you catch something far more dangerous than intended. The final hunt led to Corosil 5, where a webway portal lurked in forests too dense even for the White Scar's beloved bikes. The Khan, never one to let mere circumstance dictate his methods, led the charge on foot. The Drukhari emerged like wasps from a disturbed nest, their pain engines and twisted creations turning the forest into a carnival of horrors. Many sons of the Khan died screaming. Others suffered a worse fate, capture and transport to Kamara's dark arenas. But still the great Khan advanced, his fury growing with each step. The Archon waited before his portal, directing his forces with casual arrogance, smiling even as the great Khan cut through his warriors. Perhaps he thought his elaborate trap foolproof. Perhaps he even believed he could escape through his portal before the Khan reached him. He was wrong on both counts. When Jaghatai and his entire First Brotherhood followed the Archon through the portal, some say it was the heat of pursuit that drove him. Others, more contemplative, suggest the Khan saw something else, an endless realm of paths to explore, wars to wage, hunts to complete. The portal collapsed behind them, leaving only questions and slaughter in their wake. The White Scars who remained turned their grief into vengeance, butchering every Drukhari left behind by their fleeing master. For weeks they searched, their storm-seers casting their minds into the warp, but found no trace of their Primarch. Some whisper that perhaps the Khan found what he truly sought, freedom without limit, an eternal hunt through paths unknown to any save the eldest races. Such whispers are not always welcome among their brothers, but the doubt lingers like smoke after battle. Now the chapter maintains the position of Master of the Hunt, keeping alive their Primarch's legacy of relentless pursuit. Every 25 years, during the rites of howling, they choose their next great quarry. The skulls of the hunted line the road to Quanzhou, each masked in silver, each a testament that even 10,000 years later, the sons of the Khan never forget their prey. The art of the hunt runs in White Scar's blood, from their first days as tribesmen on Chogoris to their elevation as transhuman warriors. While others might speak of the legendary Master of the Hunt, the truth is every White Scar is a hunter in his own right. They are, after all, sons of the greatest hunter humanity has ever known. In the early 41st millennium, they proved this heritage in their pursuit of the Shattling Prince, a Drukhari homunculus who had turned the Asmari system into his personal playground. This particular monster had been poisoning food supplies bound for Imperial war fronts and collecting Imperial soldiers like particularly interesting insects for his collection. Jaghatai Khan, commander of the Third Brotherhood, understood that when hunting predators, sometimes you must play the prey. While most commanders might have charged in with guns blazing, Jaghatai chose the patient path. He scattered his forces like seeds across the system, hiding most of his strength beyond the Mandeville Point, while small teams infiltrated civilian ships. Only then did he spring his trap, leading what appeared to be a reckless assault on Asmari Tertius. The Drukhari, never ones to resist such obvious bait, responded exactly as planned. The Shattling Prince, his ego presumably bruised by such defiance, launched a massive assault to capture this impudent Space Marine commander. The moment the Drukhari revealed themselves across multiple worlds, thinking they had caught the Imperium flat-footed, the White Scars showed them the true meaning of being outmaneuvered. The main fleet arrived guided by their Stormseer's psychic cry. Some scout teams died to the last man, keeping their prey occupied until reinforcements arrived. Others were saved at the last moment, though victory came at a brutal cost. But the Shattling Prince remained elusive, hiding in his webway lair. Jaghatai Khan, remembering all too well how his Primarch vanished through such portals, refused to let his warriors follow. A wise decision for his men, but one that would cost him dearly. Less than a year later, they found him in his meditation cell, his death a grotesque artwork of frozen blood and shattered glass. The message was clear enough. The Shattling Prince considered himself the true hunter, reaching out from his dark realm to claim his prey. But he forgot something crucial about the sons of the Khan. They never forget their quarry. A new hunt has begun, and it will not end until vengeance is claimed. The sons of the Khan carry their father's greatest lesson in their bones. There is always more to learn. Pride they have in abundance, but arrogance? That's a luxury they know better than to afford. The galaxy has too many ways to teach humility, and few teachers are as brutal as the Tyrannid hive fleets. On Hardek, Chaplain Subdakar and his warriors of the Second Brotherhood learned this lesson the hard way, their bodies and gene seed consumed by the endless swarms of hive fleet Hydra. The defeat was absolute, the kind that would have broken lesser warriors, but the White Scars know that sometimes the best lessons are written in blood. Jaghatai Khan, master of the Second Brotherhood, turned to the ancient wisdom stored in Quan Zhou's libraries. The Stormseers joined his contemplation, for when hunting a prey that thinks with a million minds, one needs every advantage. The hunting ground they chose was Horatian Utuk, a world balanced on the edge of volcanic apocalypse. When they found the Tyrannids already assaulting the boar hives, their bodies piled like living siege ramps against the walls, Jaghatai implemented his plan. The Second Brotherhood arrived armed with enough flame weapons to make a salamander envious. Their initial strike was devastating, a wall of fire that even the Tyrannid's legendary regeneration couldn't overcome. The prey reacted exactly as intended, calling down reinforcements from orbit like a rain of horror. The White Scars' retreat was precisely measured, not too fast to be unbelievable, not too slow to be fatal. Though they lost brothers to the swarm, each death was a calculated sacrifice, drawing more and more of the hive fleet onto the unstable ground. Their aircraft danced through the skies, eliminating synapse creatures with terrible accuracy, each death cry drawing yet more Tyrannids into the trap. When the critical moment came, the White Scars soared away like the hunting birds of their homeworld, leaving their prey to the planet's molten hunger. Hundreds of thousands of Tyrannid organisms died in minutes, teaching the hive mind a lesson about underestimating its prey. For Jaghatai Khan and his warriors, it was just the beginning, the first payment on a debt of vengeance that would take many such victories to settle. And so, we have arrived at the end of our tale of the White Scars, the only legion that managed to make their enemies motion sick. Think about that for a moment. In a galaxy full of demons, tyrannids, and whatever the Mechanicus turns into when they've had too much engine oil, the White Scars distinguished themselves by making warfare look like a particularly aggressive motorcycle show. The White Scars understand something their brothers often forget, that freedom and duty aren't opposites. They serve the Imperium not despite their wild nature, but because of it. They are the wind given purpose, the storm harnessed, but never truly tamed. Their Primarch might be lost somewhere in the dark paths between worlds, still hunting enemies we can only imagine. Or perhaps he found what he was always looking for, that perfect stretch of road that never ends, that eternal hunt that knows no boundaries. The White Scars don't seem particularly worried either way. They know that somewhere, somehow, the great Khan still rides. In an Imperium increasingly bound by doctrine and protocol, they remain gloriously, defiantly themselves. They paint their armor white not because it's practical, it isn't, or because it's intimidating, though try telling them that, but because they want their enemies to see them coming and still not be able to do anything about it. They are the sons of the steppes, the hunters in the void, the warriors who laugh while they kill. In a galaxy that grows grimmer by the millennium, perhaps that's exactly what humanity needs. Warriors who haven't forgotten how to find joy in the spraying of arterial blood and humor in the face of death.